Boomtown is the penultimate episode of Series 1, and it's an odd one. It's a product of its genesis, frankly, more than any other episode I've covered before, and will likely cover for some while. There were no scripts, no money to make a script if there ever was one, and not a fucking clue what to do. Now, you might ask how that last one is different from the rest of NuWho, haha, but in the end this was an episode that had to be pulled out of Russell T Davies' arse, and in a different way from the usual way he does that, haha, again. See, in The End of the World, which I covered a few months ago, RTD accidentally spent most of the series' budget, a small whoopsie, which left very little money for the rest of the series. This, combined with the initially proposed script not working out, left him with no script and no money, which led to this. An episode shot in Cardiff itself, thus meaning no travel budget needed, using either existing sets or Cardiff locations, using existing props and costumes, and of course an existing monster, so there was no need for wasting time coming up with a new one and its backstory. Rarely was the scope of a story from any point of view quite so limited, even through the classic series, and never mind into NuWho, and yet here we are. 45 minutes with Cardiff as a backdrop and a villain who had spent 2 episodes farting only a few weeks earlier. Expectations are not high. Boomtown is fine. It's not particularly good, but it's not particularly bad either. It's about as unremarkable as you can get in terms of what's on the screen. While it has a threadbare and weak plot and some weak comedy, and it's NuWho, what do you expect? It at least tries some character work and does what it can with a very limited scope, which combined with some good ideas means, again, it's fine. It's odd that I think a bit of a myth has grown up around this episode, but it was poorly received. Admittedly, that's just what I felt myself over the years, but to be honest, I think the few people who actually care about this episode either feel as I do about it, or enjoy it as a bit of fun, which is not an opinion I share, but whatever floats your boat. So, you may ask, why am I reviewing it? 2 reasons. Firstly, I had no idea what to actually review. I scanned the list of NuWho episodes as I do, and that's the case. Didn't get far through as I went through Series 1 and realised that if I hurried up, I could have it so that Bad Wolf and the Parting of the Ways would be the last Ninth Doctor story I review when I get to it as part of the Dalek review, so this seemed like an obvious choice given all the others more fit more naturally elsewhere. Secondly, I think it's interesting to explore what happens when you're working with pretty much nothing, and to compare to previous instances in the show's history when this was the case, such as the Invasion of Time. And also investigate why arguably this hasn't happened again. The answer seems pretty obvious. The success of the first series saw bigger budgets going forward, the showrunners learnt the lesson, didn't overspend on individual episodes, and smarter production scheduling such as the Dr. Light episodes prevented what other issues caused this to come up. But perhaps there's a little bit more to it than that, perhaps a change in storytelling approaches, and thus leaving this episode as a rather unique artifact as something NuWho never quite became. Or perhaps not. We'll try and find out at least, because I'm not filling out 20 minutes otherwise. So we might as well get on with it and start as I usually do with the production. This episode was directed by Joe Ahearne. Ahearne? I don't know, I can never pronounce anything, let's just go with Ahearne, who directed several episodes in Series 1, including all 3 Dalek episodes and the previously covered Father's Day, which you may recall I rated very highly. He never returned after the series, and it has been reported that his returning to direct was a condition for Eccleston's return that never happened for the Day of the Doctor. So given we now know that all was not well behind the scenes for Series 1, and with those bits of information, my guess is that he took Eccleston's side in the disputes. But obviously that's only a guess, so don't take that as hearsay or anything. It probably also helps he knew what the fuck he was doing, unlike Keith Boak, which is also a bonus. His work here is pretty good. It's hardly the most stunningly visual episode of Who ever put together, but given what it is, I think he does well. Some of his camera angles throughout, making use of the wide open space of Cardiff Bay, which is the main setting of the episode, and also does reasonably well with some of the closer scenes as well. The camera work in the scene between the Doctor and Margaret does work in setting the right tone of the scene. In terms of what's on the screen, it moves pretty well, never slows down or becomes boring, in spite of the script most of the time, and I think Ahearne does well in making something for this, and for that he deserves credit. The rest of the production, well, there's nothing to talk about because there's barely anything to it. As I said, it's filmed on location, in the TARDIS interior, and then maybe a few generic sets that could also be locations, maybe. The only props or costumes are the Sylvine costume from the previous 2-parter and a light bulb they put in the TARDIS console, and that's about it. I suppose there's a nice model of a power station in Cardiff. That probably cost at least a tenner to put together. Look, what do you want from me? This is what I'm working with here. Anyway, as I said, this script came about as a result of several things going wrong, or at least more things going wrong than usual is for NuWho. There's a lot of conflicting information over what happened, but generally it's accepted that a writer called Paul Abbott was going to write an episode set in Pompeii for this slot. Given the budget problems, this was never going to happen anyway, but I'm not certain it would have been wise straight after a historical setting in the Empty Child 2-parter, and the proposed storyline of Rose turning out to have been manipulated by the Doctor to become the perfect companion in, well, seems pretty close to a shameless rip-off of Ace's backstory. Seems like it would have been pretty crap if I'm honest. The Moffat most important person ever crap pulled half a decade early. Those have also caused the budgetary issues that the overspending on the end of the world caused, leaving there to be no money as well as no script. But don't worry, you were filming in the most photogenic city in Britain, Cardiff! All the important locations were used in this, like the Bay, and Cardiff Central Station, and did I mention the Bay? Alright, jokes aside, I don't actually dislike Cardiff, I just find it very funny the fact that Doctor Who has been made by BBC Wales means it is forced to have been set so many stories, and indeed an entire fucking spin-off, in what is not the top of the list of those interesting British cities, but I digress. What I will immediately give to this episode is that it knows what its scope is, and is structured around that. It doesn't bite off more than it can chew. Maybe that sounds like damning with faint praise, but sometimes you need to go small is something that often eludes NuWho, and going for smaller, more limited character study was definitely the smart move. Now, admittedly, the story itself is not the strongest, and how many of these problems come from a lack of time and resources, and how many of them come from, well, NuWho and RTD in particular's usual foibles, who knows? This episode, of course, is notable for establishing the Cardiff Rift, and the stuff that would eventually lead to Torchwood. But we won't hold that against it, and while it's a bit of a silly technobabble arsepool, I think as a setup, rather than a conclusion, as silly technobabble arsepools tend to be in Doctor Who, and indeed are in this episode, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, it's a simple idea. The TARDIS needs refueling, with a solution that makes sense in the universe, sucking up time, energy, or whatever, and that provides a setup to the episode that can be explained in 2 or 3 sentences and justifies a limited setting. Yeah, I know, they'd already introduced the riff earlier on in The Unquiet Dead, you don't have to yell at your computer screen to me. What I'm saying is this particular use for it was set up so quickly, and I think it works. It's a good way to structure things starting out, giving a clear setup that makes sense while also signalling this is not going to be the biggest thing ever. In fact, the structure is probably the strongest part of the episode, in that it sets out very well to make use of what it has, both in terms of its resources and the NuWho episode format. We start out with one villain character, bring her together with the heroes in a quick and silly but realistic way, build character and give something to think about before coming together in a finale with a bit of peril. Now, parts of that plot itself are extremely dubious, and don't work as part of an actual story, but in terms of how it's structured, I think it's pretty much the perfect way to do an episode like this. Small, low-key, focused on character, and with a bit of mild peril as the only real high-stakes moment, I think that's a very right approach. I'm aware I'm talking about the fate of the entire Earth as mild peril, but you understand what I mean. It's not sort of the same kind of epic stuff we get throughout the rest of NuWho. I also think the focus of the episode is very much in the right place as well. Having a strong focus on the Rose-Mickey relationship takes something that's already been well established in the series, but definitely is a bit more mileage to go for it. I'll examine this stuff in detail in a moment, but in terms of deciding to focus on this, good choice. It's pre-existing, so no setup needed, but you're not going to just be repeating yourself either. Likewise, bringing up a recent villain in Margaret Savine was a good idea. Requires little setup, means we can immediately jump into the action with a 2-minute teaser that tells us everything we need to know what's happening. And yeah, this is a good teaser actually. While the bloke might as well write dead on his forehead in felt tip from the first frame, and I'm not sure it quite gels with some stuff that happens later in the episode, admittedly, we'll get to that later, it gives the audience every single bit of information they need going in. It's Margaret Savine, she's now the Mayor of Cardiff, she's up to no good, and still very much how we remember her. It's simple, no frills, but in an episode where you have nothing to work with, that's very much the right way to do things. Unfortunately, not all the structure works quite so well. The pacing's not great, but in the opposite way to how this is usually a problem in NuWho. Instead of being too fast, it feels utterly glacial at points. Now again, I've talked at length about the genesis of the episode, so it's not surprising, but it's disappointing when an interesting character study was gift-wrapped and instead there's quite so much dead air as there is. It takes at least 15 minutes or so to actually get into the meat of the episode, which is a mistake. I think the stuff where the Doctor and co get involved with Margaret should have been wrapped up in the first 10 minutes, and more time spent on the interesting character dynamics. As I'll get to it in a bit, a phrase I'm fairly used to saying at this point, there doesn't really feel like enough time to actually look at those characters. A little bit too much focus is put where it isn't needed, and not enough where it is. Despite the good setup, the structure just doesn't quite work. Stuff that another draft might have sorted out, so again, perhaps a symptom of this having to be put together from nothing. As I said, the episode is wise in focusing on character, so let's take a look at some of those characters. Rose and Mickey take up a big chunk of the episode as they reflect on their relationship, how it has essentially been replaced by Rose's relationship with the Doctor, and Mickey's rather understandable frustrations at all this. I like a lot of this stuff. It comes from a very natural place for this character journey. As I said earlier, again, it was a pre-established relationship, so they didn't have to waste any time setting it up, and it does explore new ground for it. It has a very solid foundation going in, which is always key. It's also looking at something new. Classic Who certainly never looked at anything like this, and it presents a real and tangible consequence of TARDIS travel, pushing someone who we were previously close to away. Exploring something new is always a great thing to do with characters, and I think taking this new era of Doctor Who, and while remaining familiar in many ways, doing new stuff like this, I think that was the right call. And while NuWho got a lot of its other calls wrong, they got that one right. Mickey's frustrations have led him to become distant from Rose, and make his attempts to try and get closer again seem hollow and half-hearted. It's clear he doesn't really want to go back to how things were any more than Rose does, and he's going through the motions for perhaps his own reasons, or perhaps, I don't know, Rose's approval or something, just because he feels like he has to. It's not exactly the most complex thing in the world, but it does present us with, as I said, something new and unique, but also something that does work well with the characters that have been set up for Rose and Mickey. It feels in character their reactions for both of them. I like also how it's humanising for them both, in a way that Rose will absolutely get nothing of in the next series once RTDA become over-enthusiastic about her brilliance, but it certainly shows how both of them are flawed people, and how Rose, despite everything we've seen about how great she is with the Doctor, she is letting some of her previous responsibilities slip. I don't think we're necessarily supposed to sympathise with either of them, and that's good. But the two actors play it very well as well, this stuff definitely works. Except, of course, when it ends up not actually having an ending. They separate when the crisis starts, Mickey gets grumpy about it, and that's it. There's no actual resolution to the problem, no moment when they realise they need to let go of the past or anything, just Mickey stares off in the distance and that's the end. This undermines the idea this is supposed to be playing into finale as well, where this would be finally properly resolved, because it doesn't get properly resolved there. So it doesn't get properly resolved here, because it has to lead into the finale, but then nothing really is done with it there. It's a shame, because it had worked well up until this point, and just a few minor tweaks, a final conversation or something, I think would have made it sit a lot stronger in that respect. Oh, Captain Jack is in this. He's very obviously only here because he needs to be in the two stories either side of this one, and absolutely not in this one at all, because there's absolutely fuck all for him to do. But then, I'm not particularly complaining about that. If I wanted to see the adventures of Gropey McGrope, I'd watch his crappy spin-off. Particularly given this is before his immortality, the only interesting thing about him became a thing, so all he does here is make bad jokes. Admittedly, he does have one funny line though.
Sweet, look at these two. How come I never get any of that?
Buy me a drink first.
Such hard work.
But worth it.
This was of course the Ninth Doctor's penultimate episode, and you get the feeling that given it was pretty certain to everyone he was leaving by this point, the idea of developing him further was just sort of put to the wayside a bit. Now, Christopher Eccleston is still at the top of his game, he's not the problem here, but I get the feeling of the Doctor's characters I fear, but they weren't quite sure what to do with a character they were shortly going to be getting rid of. The idea is, in theory, sound. The Doctor is faced with a villain who has killed many people and is in the process of killing more, and clearly has some kind of evil plan up their sleeve, but nevertheless has no way of dealing with them that won't lead to their death. Returning Margaret to Rax Corica Bloody will lead to a horrific and painful execution. He can't send her anywhere else because she'll just get rescued and go back to her ways, and obviously he can't let her carry on with her evil plan. He's faced with a genuine dilemma, and one that even this Time War scarred Doctor is going to be genuinely torn up over. Except, not really. He seems pretty set on the decision from the moment he has to take it, and at no point it seems like it's racking him particularly. For as much as Margaret tries to shift him, it seems like there's no real point where he is at all cracking. He's decided she'll need to die, and that's about it. Now, I get it, he's still suffering from the Time War, he's angry and darker, and sees Margaret, correctly, as a murderer and a terrible person. It makes sense why, but there are two problems I have with this. Firstly, even with that, I don't like the Doctor having this judge, jury and executioner thing going on. I didn't like it in The End of the World, and I don't like it here. I can't pretend it doesn't rub me the wrong way, because that's not who the Doctor is, no matter how changed by the war he has been. Secondly, from a storytelling point of view, it doesn't work as a character beat because there's no arc or change at all. He starts with one opinion about it, that she's going to have to go and die, holds it throughout the episode, and then has it completely vindicated at the end. It doesn't exactly make for a compelling character journey when we're basically just seeing a man having an opinion, but at no point does he seem particularly troubled by or interested in changing. It's a pity because I can easily see the Doctor admitting that he is torn up inside about it or something like that admission that this isn't easy while still not bending from it. But there's nothing like that at all. It just seems like this is what he feels and that's what we're supposed to see. Hell, he doesn't even react that much to the MacGuffin ending. He just seems to be happy everything has worked out brilliantly by accident, absolving himself of any moral issues while neatly solving the problem. Not that he cared particularly about those moral issues in the first place. All that's really explored is the back and forth between him and Margaret, which is much more effective coming from him than it is going to him. All that's really explored is a back and forth between him and Margaret, which is much more effective coming from him than it is going to him. Margaret can do nothing but say the repetitive guff about how he's really a killer who leaves disaster in his wake, blah blah blah. Even by the 11th episode of NuWho, this was old hat. There are a few nice lines.
You let one of them go, but that's nothing new. Every now and then a little victim's spared because she smiled, because he's got freckles, because they begged. And that's how you live with yourself. That's how you slaughter millions. Because once in a while, on a whim, if the wind's in the right direction, you happen to be kind.
Only a killer would know that.
That is a good rebuttal of Margaret's pleas, but also a look at the Doctor himself. You can imagine this is him talking about his own Time War self as well, and a sign of where the self-loathing comes from. Never confirmed, of course, but clearly we're supposed to be making our own interpretations, and that's fine. But there's not enough of it, and I think that maybe will be something that comes out of cramming most of this into 25 minutes, because the best part of 20 is spent setting up the meat of the episode when it shouldn't be. Given the potential of the idea, even to do in a small episode like this, I think overall it's a bit of a disappointment. And then of course there's Margaret Slevene, the returning villain. And if they needed a villain to return they could reuse a costume from, this was a smart choice. Annette Badland's performance as Margaret in a two-parter was one of its more memorable aspects, and exploring a lone Slevene as opposed to the larger and more nebulous force as they were in their original appearance was a good idea. And bits of it work. The decision to bring back Badland was vindicated, she gives a great performance, but also in the script as well. The encounter the Doctor mentions in that clip a moment ago was much earlier in the episode, where Margaret, fully intending to kill a journalist snooping around a bit too much, hesitates when she mentions that she has a husband and is pregnant. It's not perfect, for reasons I'll get to, but the message is very sound. It's very easy to press a button to start a scheme that will kill millions of people who are faceless to you, and always will be. A hell of a lot harder to stare someone in the face who you know has a life worth living, and kill them anyway. It's like that Stalin quote. A single death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Now, we don't know if Stalin would have actually hesitated if forced to do the deed himself, rather than have all the killings carried out in his name far away from him, but clearly Margaret did, and this gives her a bit of humanity. Not much. Not enough for her to let go of who she really is, and that is perhaps her fatal flaw, but a bit. I don't think this stuff is perfect. She's been killing a lot of people after all, including the teaser and the long unfunny list of people who've had accidents, but I don't think there's enough separation between this woman she saves and them. Nearly, but not quite. The Doctor's rebuttal is enough to make up for that, I feel. It really tears her argument apart, and that Margaret is forced into accusing the Doctor and then pleading for a life based on no real argument shows how successful he's been there, so that's a bit more swings and roundabouts. The biggest issue with it, though, is just kinda comes out of nowhere. Margaret never showed these kind of thoughts in the previous story. She was there to face the Slevene in their extremely murderous plan, and to have her suddenly develop a conscience feels like it's a bit of an arse pull. Again, I get it, they're supposed to be showing us how this sudden moment has brought her face to face with what she does and who she is, but I think it's just a bit too convenient. It feels a bit like she's doing it because the script says so, and this is further reinforced by the fact we have swerved back to familiar Margaret almost immediately. It makes it feel like this encounter has had no effect on her at all. We go from ordinary Margaret to conscious Margaret and then back again. I guess you could argue that all it does is give her a convenient excuse she can launch at the Doctor, and that her failing to learn the lesson is in character, but if that's the case the episode should have focused on that more than it did, and not just given it a couple of exposited lines. Her back and forth with the Doctor, it's a good scene overall, but not all of it works. There are some really great lines.
You've been in that skin suit too long. You've forgotten. There used to be a real Margaret Blaine. You killed her and stripped her and used the skin. You're pleading for mercy out of a dead woman's lips.
And seeing her arguments torn apart does work in setting her character, as someone who is clearly so self-serving and struggles to hide it. But then even this scene, as good as it is, it just begins to drag for a while with all the back and forth. It just feels a bit more expositive than it should. As for the rest of her story, well, it's filled with holes, but this is NuWho after all. She became Mayor of Cardiff not long after being involved in a major national incident, somehow. He was planning to build a nuclear power station in the middle of a city of several 100,000 people. Can apparently do this on the authority of a mayor and not, involve central government in any way. Apparently Cardiff's municipal budget is enough to build a fucking nuclear power station. And safety concerns are met with, nah, it'll be fine. Which apparently everyone except a few now unsuspiciously dead people accepted without a second thought. It's so flimsy you could put a stick through it, and it's really where the lack of time begins to rear its head. You can clearly tell this was thrown together quickly. This nearly brings us onto the plot which has made the episode's main weaknesses come to bear. Aside from the silly holes I mentioned, her plan makes no real sense and is dependent on Technobaba's silliness. She's going to surf her way out of it, apparently. As I said, there are structural issues with the story that mean we just sort of meander through the first 15 to 20 minutes or so, which feels very padded out. The Scooby-Doo chase when they first capture Margaret outstays its welcome in a huge way, and frankly is about as effective as NuWho usually is a comedy. Not very. Then of course there's the ending, which is a technobabble arseball that doesn't work. Imagine that. Out of fucking nowhere, the TARDIS suddenly has a heart, which can perform what's basically magic, and turn Margaret back into an egg. Now, that last bit is fine, finally giving her a chance to make amends by having a whole new life, which has this great line.
She can start again. Live a life from scratch. If we take her home, give her to a different family, tell them to bring her up properly, she might be alright.
Or she might be worse.
That's her choice.
But the whole thing is very blatantly a MacGuffin out of nowhere to fix everything in the last 5 minutes to give the TARDIS an ability it's never had before to just sort of, resolve the plot. Now, I know what you're saying, this is obviously set up for the finale where this gets used again, to which I have two rebuttals. Firstly, it doesn't make its appearance here any less of an arseball, it needs to have been set up a hell of a lot better than it was, or indeed at all, and it doesn't matter if it feels to set up another story, it makes this one feel unsatisfying, and this is the one I'm reviewing. Secondly, it was still a convenient plot fixing MacGuffin in the finale, even if it was set up here. A convenient win and resolve the plot button doesn't become any less unsatisfying even if you've already used it, but as I just said, I'm reviewing this episode, not that one, so I'll leave that for the future. So yeah, the plot is a bit threadbare and weak. It was clearly a victim of being put together at the last minute and clearly needs some redrafting to put more meat on the bone, which would have gone a long way to addressing the plotting and pacing issues. I don't think this is bad, it has some good character work and it's got an interesting and unique structure, but I don't think it's good either, it just lacks any real substance to either the basic plot or what it wants to explore. I said at the start I'd look at this episode's place within the show's history. After all, I'd say compared to the Invasion of Time, this did a better job with nothing. It is tighter and smarter, well, not high bar's clear, I'll admit. At least had an idea of what it wanted to be with what it had, and I can hardly think of a better idea in that case. It all has an odd place because, as I said, it came with unique circumstances that haven't been repeated. Later series had higher budgets, showrunners didn't overspend in the same way, and the schedule changed. First to introduce Doctor Light episodes to reduce the burden, and then increasingly reduced episode counts so all these kind of episode slots slowly disappear. But also, Doctor Who changed. If I were to be uncharitable, I'd say the showrunners got high on their own supply of their success, and decided that everything needs to be huge and bombastic and epic, and kind of left episodes like this behind. It's a unique look at Doctor Who doing something small, in a way it arguably hasn't done since the 60s, and arguably hasn't come close to doing since. It might not have been entirely successful, but it's an odyssey that deserves some interest despite that, and well, if you're paying attention, then it's doing something right. Even if it's doing a lot else wrong. Final score for Boomtown is 5 out of 10. It's typical NuWho. Good in ideas and a few interesting beats here and there, and it tries to do good stuff with its characters, but ends up tripping over itself as only NuWho can, and ends up feeling like a less than satisfying result. Probably needed more time, more drafts to iron out the issues, and given the story's genesis, that time just wasn't there. It's a shame as there was some potential here, but overall it could have been a hell of a lot worse, and for that we should be grateful. NuWho doesn't always indulge us there after all, does it? Margaret can do nothing but say the repetitive guff about he's really a killer who leaves disaster in his wake, blah blah blah. Even by merely the 12th episode of NuWho. This was not the 12th episode of NuWho, this was the 11th episode of NuWho.